Hello, everybody. This is the Human Population Lecture, and I thought it would be cool to spend some time thinking about how our human population is growing. We know that it is growing, and through history, what we've seen is we really had really low populations of just a couple million people for a long time. And once we start to get like really organized agriculture, which is really only about 1,000 years ago or so, that is when our populations really start to increase. And recently, maybe in the last 100 years or so, what we've seen is how we change human populations is that basically we don't like maybe think of it this way: the natural way that humans were growing, let's say, 200 years ago, is a bunch of babies died. So remember, we are in this type 1 survivorship curve where a lot of babies died. A lot of kids didn't make it past age 5, but then we have this relatively kind of even decrease through time. But again, we don't really live much past 100 years old. Now, what we see in, recent times, let's say the last 50, 60, 70 years, um, we've kind of gotten rid of that infant mortality and we've increased the lifespan of most people. Again, nobody really makes it past 100 years old. We have some people out there, but it's kind of made us even more of that type 1 survivorship curve. So if we look at, the past, what we see is a lot of people really, really often saying that our population, the human population, is increasing at an incredible rate, and eventually there's going to be this crash. So in the 1968, this famous ecologist named Paul Ehrlich wrote this book called The Population Bomb that had some really interesting predictions of like food wars over the amount of food that we would have by like the 1980s, and that our populations would be crashing by the 1990s. And we know that that didn't come to pass due to increases in the technological increases in agriculture and genetic engineering, modification of our food. But what we do know is there is some carrying capacity for humans on Earth, right? As more humans are growing, more of the Earth's energy is going to be towards put into human biomass, so we know other species will decrease, which means that we will have less natural areas and less stuff for us to do and eat and live in. So we're somewhere in this still in this increasing population, but what is going to happen then? Are we going to start flattening out like that logistic curve, or are we going to overshoot it and then our human population will collapse because we've had so much, food being wasted and eaten? So the question is how to avoid this. How do we avoid this overshoot? What is how do we make it so that we start to even out our population and stop at some level? And there's basically two ways to do that. Increase the death rate, which is not okay, right? Or we curb the birth rate. So basically people need to start having fewer babies, so that our populations can stabilize. And the basically two best ways to do that is promote contraception and educate women. So the more education that women have, the more they generally spend time with their careers and less time with their children. Now that's not to say career women aren't good moms. I'm not saying that, but what we see is that the more education level, and I'm talking like high school education, because there's plenty of places on the planet where women are not allowed, girls are not allowed to go to school past, elementary school. But, the more education that we have, the more generally across the world, the fewer babies that we sometimes have. Now, what we see then is population growth is very different in different countries. So this is a type of graph where it has age ranges on the y-axis here, and then this is the number of people. So Nigeria is a country that its population is growing incredibly quickly. And the best way to think about this is, okay, look how many children there are. There's 20 million babies here from 0 to 4. So let's think about in 20 years when these people are between 20 and 24 and start having children. So again, since we're pretty much a type 1 survivorship curve, there's going to be 20 million people here at 20 to 24, which then will be having babies. And how many babies are they going to have? It would be way wide out, here. They're going to have a whole lot of babies. The United States is growing slowly. It's mostly due to actually immigration that we're growing, but you can see that there's this baby boomer bump here. These data are a little old, so these should be a little bit higher. But we can still see somewhat, the bottom layers are a little wider out than above it. Whereas a lot of Northern European countries that are actually decreasing in population, so there's fewer children here than there are, middle-aged and adult people. So the answer, or the question I want to ask is, should you have kids or not, right? And if we are super, super interested in trying to curb population growth so we don't have 20 billion people on this planet, it's a really tricky thing, because let's think about kids here in the US. I have 2 kids. I love them dearly, but they're really an economic drain, right? I have to send them to school. I have to buy them school supplies. I have to fix their cavities in their teeth, right? So kids are not allowed to work. They can't work until they're 15 years old or whatever, and so during that time they're a complete economic gain, or economic drain, I should say. Sorry. But think about a developing country, right? In this situation, children are very much an economic help, right? Once you have enough children, the older children can start watching the littler children. The older children can start working, right? It's really cheap labor when you have your children and you don't need to pay them, right? Because they're just part of the family and they're working on the farm. They can do housework. They can do all sorts of things. And in certain developing countries that don't have a good retirement system, children are the Social Security net. So you have a lot of children so that they can support you, right? So when you get old and can't work anymore, you move in with one of your children, and the other children help pay for you as you are older. So that's some of the reasons why we have a lot more. We see, the developing countries having a lot more babies. The idea, though, of having a population overshoot its carrying capacity and crash is not just a human problem. Okay, so this is a story thinking about snow geese. Now, snow geese are these, white birds. Here's the male and the female together. And in the 1960s, there were 800,000 of these geese. They breed up in northern Canada around Hudson Bay, and then they fly down through Canada, through the United States, and overwinter in the southern United States. So today we have somewhere around 3 to 5 million of these geese, and the numbers are extremely high, and there's places where you can go, these are the breeding grounds of these geese, and it's just insane how many geese there are there. And it's become a huge problem because of all of these geese. what you're getting is these geese come to these areas and completely denude the landscape of vegetation. So this is a before and after picture around this Hudson Bay. You can see here is that same tower, and what's happening is, because there's so many geese, there's too many geese, they eat all the vegetation, and the land actually gets really salty. That's what's happening here. Is there's because there's so much evaporation, the water leaves and is left with salt, and this red stuff here is bacteria. What these fences are fenced off areas that don't allow the geese, and this is what the landscape should look like, not this completely bare rock or covered in red bacteria, right? The reason these geese then are increasing in numbers so and causing these problems is because, back in the 60s, there wasn't that much grain available to these geese. So you would have mass die-offs in the migration event from northern Canada down to the southern United States. But since there is so much grain, since there is so much corn left in the fields and wheat and everything, these geese are able to fuel up. They do not have this long, grueling journey anymore from northern Canada to the southern U.S., and the mortality rates over the winter are much, much lower than they used to be. So the question is, how do we deal with these geese, right? Should the Canadians drive with helicopters and machine guns mowing down these geese as they're going around? Should they poison a bunch of these geese? And, frankly, that there is some of that. Definitely some people are against that, and I understand why that would be. But what we've basically, the conservation method that the United States and Canada has gotten basically hunters to do the work for them. There's essentially, you can pretty much in many states shoot as many snow geese as you want in a day. You can use automatic shotguns that are unplugged, electronic calls, all sorts of things to try to get these geese. It's only this species you can do that to, right? All those things are illegal for other geese species. But it's in some ways a no-cost conservation effort where I have friends that will go to North Dakota and hunt and collect 200, 300 geese all over, their week trip there. And then they never have to buy chicken over the year because they're just eating goose meat a lot. They must like goose meat a lot. I'm sure they share a lot of it. But, it's a good way, at least in my opinion, to help protect these areas up in northern Canada, and help protect the landscape from these geese that are frankly our problem, right? We created this problem by increasing the amount of agriculture. So I think it's up to us to try to solve it. Again, that's my opinion. There's a lot of dead geese here, and I can understand why some people might not be happy about that. But something is going to have to be done. I would much rather see these geese go into the mouths of these hunters rather than just be poisoned up in Canada. All right, that's it for this lecture. Hope you enjoyed it, and see you all later.